In the winter of 1637, a single tulip bulb sold for more than the price of a grand canal house in Amsterdam. Within weeks, that same bulb was worth less than an onion. This is the story of Tulip Mania, history's first recorded speculative bubble, and a cautionary tale that echoes through financial markets to this day. The Dutch Republic in the early 17th century was a place of unprecedented wealth and innovation. The Dutch had broken free from Spanish rule and established themselves as the world's leading maritime power. Their ships dominated global trade routes, bringing exotic goods from Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Amsterdam became the financial capital of Europe, home to the world's first modern stock exchange. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, was the world's first publicly traded corporation. Wealth flowed into the Netherlands at an astonishing rate. But it wasn't just material wealth that flooded into the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Golden Age was also a period of cultural and intellectual flourishing. Artists like Rembrandt and Vermeer captured the prosperity of the era on canvas. Scientists and philosophers found refuge in the Netherlands' tolerant society. The Dutch pioneered advances in banking, insurance, and financial instruments that would shape modern capitalism. They invented the concept of the joint stock company and developed sophisticated credit markets. This was a society at the cutting edge of economic development. Into this prosperous world came the tulip. The flower originated in the mountainous regions of Central Asia and had been cultivated by the Ottoman Turks for centuries. Turkish sultans adorned their gardens with thousands of tulips, and the flower became a symbol of wealth and power in Ottoman culture. European diplomats and traders who visited Constantinople were enchanted by these exotic blooms. In 1554, the Habsburg ambassador Oger Gisela de Busbecq sent tulip seeds and bulbs back to Vienna. From there, the flower spread across Europe. The tulip arrived in the Netherlands around 1593, brought by the botanist Carolus Clusius. Clusius was appointed director of the Leiden University Botanical Garden, where he cultivated a collection of rare plants from around the world. Among his prized specimens were tulip bulbs he had brought from Austria. Clusius was a meticulous scientist who carefully controlled access to his collection. He refused to sell or share his tulip bulbs, conducting research on the flower's breeding and cultivation. This exclusivity only increased demand for the mysterious flower. Legend has it that thieves broke into Clusius's garden and stole his bulbs, distributing them throughout the Netherlands. Whether or not this story is true, tulips did spread rapidly across the Dutch Republic in the early 1600s. The wealthy merchant class, eager to display their prosperity, began cultivating elaborate gardens. Tulips became the ultimate status symbol, a way for newly rich traders to demonstrate their refinement and taste. What made tulips particularly desirable was their extraordinary variety and unpredictability. Unlike most flowers, tulips could display an astonishing range of colors and patterns. Some bulbs produced solid-colored flowers in red, yellow, white, or purple. Others created flowers with intricate streaks, flames, and feathered patterns in multiple colors. The most prized tulips featured dramatic color contrasts and complex designs. A single bulb might produce a plain red flower for several years before suddenly blooming with spectacular red and white flames. This unpredictability was caused by a virus, though 17th-century Dutch growers didn't understand the mechanism. The tulip-breaking virus, spread by aphids, caused the flowers to develop the variegated patterns that collectors found so appealing. The virus weakened the bulbs over time, making it difficult to propagate the most beautiful varieties. This natural scarcity drove prices even higher. Growers couldn't reliably predict which bulbs would produce the most spectacular flowers, adding an element of gambling to tulip cultivation. The Dutch developed an elaborate classification system for tulips based on their colors and patterns. The most valuable category was the flamed tulips, which featured dramatic streaks of color against a contrasting background. Within this category, certain varieties achieved legendary status. The Semper Augustus, with its dramatic red flames on a pure white background, became the most sought-after tulip in the Netherlands. Only a handful of Semper Augustus bulbs existed, and they rarely came up for sale. By the 1620s, tulips had become serious commodities in the Dutch economy. Professional growers cultivated fields of bulbs outside major cities. Wealthy collectors maintained extensive gardens and competed to acquire the rarest varieties. A market developed for buying and selling bulbs, with prices for the most desirable varieties climbing steadily. A single bulb of a prized variety might sell for several hundred guilders, equivalent to several years' wages for a skilled craftsman. The tulip trade operated on a unique seasonal cycle that would prove crucial to the development of the mania. Tulips bloom in April and May, and the bulbs can only be safely lifted from the ground and transported in the summer months, from June to September. During this period, buyers could inspect the actual bulbs they were purchasing. But the rest of the year, from October to May, the bulbs remained in the ground, and trading continued based on written contracts for future delivery. This system of futures trading would transform the tulip market into something far more speculative. The futures market in tulip bulbs emerged gradually in the late 1620s and early 1630s. Growers wanted to secure buyers for their crops before harvest time, and speculators saw opportunities for profit. Buyers would purchase bulbs still in the ground, agreeing to take delivery after the lifting season in exchange for a set price. If prices rose between the signing of the contract and the delivery date, the buyer made a profit. If prices fell, the buyer lost money. This system allowed traders to speculate on tulip prices without ever handling an actual bulb. The futures market introduced leverage into tulip trading. A speculator could sign contracts to purchase bulbs worth thousands of guilders with only a small down payment, typically around 5% of the total price. The balance would be due at delivery. This meant that a trader with modest capital could control a large position in the tulip market. If prices rose, the profits would be enormous relative to the initial investment. But if prices fell, the losses could exceed the trader's entire net worth. For several years, the futures market functioned relatively smoothly. Prices rose steadily, but the increases seemed justified by the growing demand for tulips and the genuine scarcity of the most beautiful varieties. Professional growers and serious collectors dominated the market. Trading took place in formal settings, often in the offices of notaries who drew up the contracts. Both buyers and sellers understood the risks and had the financial resources to honor their commitments. But in the autumn of 1636, something changed. The futures market in tulip bulbs began to attract a different sort of participant. Small traders, artisans, and even laborers started speculating in tulips. Many of these new entrants had no interest in flowers and no intention of taking delivery of bulbs. They were pure speculators, hoping to profit from rising prices. Tulip trading moved from notaries' offices to taverns, where men gathered to buy and sell contracts over beer and wine. The tavern trade transformed the character of the tulip market. The atmosphere became festive, almost carnival-like. Groups of speculators met regularly in taverns to conduct business, a practice known as collegia. These gatherings operated under informal rules. Buyers paid a small wine money fee to participate, typically a few stuvers per transaction. A slate or board displayed the tulips available for sale. Participants called out bids, and deals were sealed with handshakes and rounds of drinks. The informal setting and convivial atmosphere disguised the serious financial risks participants were taking. As the autumn of 1636 turned to winter, prices began rising at an accelerating rate. A bulb that sold for 100 guilders in November might fetch 200 in December and 500 in January. The increases defied any rational economic logic. The supply of tulip bulbs was essentially fixed until the next harvest, and the rate of increase far exceeded any plausible growth in demand. But each price rise seemed to validate the market's optimism and encouraged more people to enter the trade. The psychological dynamics of the bubble became self-reinforcing. Ordinary people watched their neighbors grow wealthy from tulip speculation and felt compelled to participate. The fear of missing out drove people to borrow money, mortgage their property, or sell their possessions to buy tulip futures. Stories circulated of chimney sweeps and weavers becoming rich overnight. The social barriers that had traditionally limited financial speculation broke down as people from all classes rushed into the tulip market. Contemporary observers noted the absurdity of the situation. One pamphlet described how a sailor, given a valuable tulip bulb as payment, assumed it was an onion and ate it for breakfast. The bulb he consumed had been worth enough to feed his entire ship's crew for a year. Another story told of a merchant who mistook a precious tulip bulb for a common onion and used it in his herring recipe. These tales, whether true or embellished, illustrated the disconnect between the market prices and the intrinsic value of the bulbs. By January 1637, the tulip market had reached levels of pure fantasy. Common bulb varieties that had previously sold for a few guilders now commanded prices in the hundreds. Rare varieties traded for thousands of guilders, and the most prized specimens reached truly astronomical valuations. A single Semper Augustus bulb was reportedly offered for sale at 5,500 guilders, enough to purchase one of the finest houses along Amsterdam's fashionable canals. Another famous transaction saw a bulb traded for a package of goods including 4 tons of wheat, 8 tons of rye, for oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, a bed, and a suit of clothes. The peak of the mania came in the first week of February 1637. At tulip auctions in Haarlem and other cities, prices reached their highest levels. Speculators competed frantically for bulbs, driving prices up by the hour. The market seemed to be in a state of collective delusion, with participants convinced that prices would continue rising forever. The Dutch believed they had discovered a path to effortless wealth, and tulips would be their vehicle. Then, suddenly, the bubble burst. On February 3, 1637, a group of buyers in Haarlem failed to appear at a scheduled tulip auction. The expected bidders simply didn't show up, leaving sellers unable to find buyers for their bulbs. Word of the failed auction spread quickly through the tulip trading network. Within days, the market collapsed. Buyers across the Netherlands refused to honor their contracts or demanded massive discounts. Sellers discovered that the bulbs they thought were worth thousands of guilders had no buyers at any price. The crash was as rapid and devastating as the rise had been euphoric. Within a few weeks, tulip bulb prices fell to a fraction of their peak values. A bulb that had traded for 5,000 guilders in early February might struggle to find a buyer at 50 guilders by March. The most common varieties became essentially worthless, with traders unable to recoup even their initial investments. The futures market, which had allowed the mania to develop, now amplified the losses. Speculators who had signed contracts to purchase bulbs at peak prices faced financial ruin. The collapse of tulip mania created a legal and social crisis in the Dutch Republic. Thousands of people had signed contracts obligating them to purchase tulip bulbs at prices they could never afford to pay. Sellers demanded payment, while buyers argued that the contracts were invalid or should be renegotiated. The Dutch courts were flooded with lawsuits as parties tried to enforce or escape their obligations. The legal system struggled to cope with the volume of cases and the novel questions they raised. The provincial government of Holland intervened in the crisis in April 1637. Authorities declared that all tulip futures contracts signed after November 1636 would be voidable, with buyers required to pay only 10% of the agreed price to cancel their contracts. This decision essentially wiped out most of the speculative contracts from the height of the mania. Sellers who thought they would receive thousands of guilders instead received nominal payments. The intervention prevented widespread bankruptcy, but left many people with substantial losses. The economic impact of tulip mania on the Dutch Republic remains a subject of historical debate. Contemporary sources suggest the damage was severe, with many families ruined by their speculation. Pamphleteers and moralists condemned the tulip trade as a form of gambling and warned that God would punish the Dutch for their greed. These accounts describe a society traumatized by the collapse of the bubble, with widespread financial distress and social upheaval. However, modern economic historians have challenged this dramatic narrative. Archival research suggests that tulip mania may have had less impact than traditionally believed. The speculation was largely confined to the futures market, and many contracts were never intended to be enforced. The actual exchange of money may have been limited, with much of the trading consisting of paper transactions. The Dutch economy continued to prosper after 1637, suggesting that the bubble didn't cause lasting damage to the nation's economic fundamentals. What is clear is that tulip mania had a significant cultural impact on the Netherlands. The episode became a cautionary tale about the dangers of speculation and the folly of believing in perpetually rising asset prices. Dutch artists and writers produced numerous works depicting the tulip craze as a form of madness. These morality tales warned against greed and the pursuit of unearned wealth. The phrase, wind trade, used to describe trading in tulip futures, became synonymous with worthless speculation. The tulip itself survived the crash and remained a beloved flower in Dutch culture. The Netherlands went on to become the world's leading producer and exporter of tulips, a position it maintains to this day. Dutch growers developed thousands of tulip varieties and built a sustainable international market for the flowers. But the tulip never again became a vehicle for wild speculation in the Netherlands. The memory of 1637 served as a lasting warning. Tulip Mania also left an important legacy in the history of financial markets. The episode demonstrated several features that would characterize future speculative bubbles. The combination of a novel asset, a futures market that enabled leverage, and widespread public participation created the conditions for extreme price volatility. The psychological dynamics of the bubble, particularly the fear of missing out and the belief that prices would rise indefinitely, would recur in countless later episodes. Economic theorists have studied tulip mania for insights into how asset bubbles form and collapse. The episode raises fundamental questions about market rationality and the formation of prices. How could educated, sophisticated Dutch merchants convince themselves that tulip bulbs were worth a fortune? Why did the market collapse so suddenly and completely? These questions remain relevant to understanding modern financial markets. Some economists argue that Tulip Mania wasn't entirely irrational. They point out that tulips were genuinely scarce luxury goods with aesthetic value. In the early stages, price increases may have reflected legitimate market forces. The problem arose when the futures market allowed speculation to detach prices from any connection to the underlying value of the flowers. The market became a self-referential system where prices rose because people expected them to rise, not because of changes in supply or demand for actual tulips. The comparison between tulip mania and modern financial bubbles is illuminating. The Dutch tulip craze shares features with the South Sea bubble of 1720, the Wall Street crash of 1929, the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, and the housing bubble of 2007 to 2008. In each case, a novel asset or financial innovation attracted widespread speculation. Prices rose to unsustainable levels driven by leverage and optimistic expectations. The bubble eventually burst, causing financial losses and economic disruption. What makes tulip mania particularly interesting is its simplicity. Unlike modern financial bubbles, which involve complex derivatives and global capital flows, the tulip craze was a straightforward speculation in flower bulbs. The basic dynamics were visible to anyone. Yet, even with this transparency, the Dutch collectively convinced themselves that tulip bulbs were valuable investments. This suggests that asset bubbles may be an inherent feature of human economic behavior, not just a result of financial complexity or inadequate regulation. The role of social dynamics in tulip mania also deserves emphasis. The bubble spread through social networks, with friends and neighbors encouraging each other to participate. The tavern trade created a communal atmosphere that normalized speculation and suppressed doubts. People who questioned the rising prices were dismissed as overly cautious or lacking in vision. This social pressure to conform made it difficult for individuals to resist participating, even if they privately doubted the sustainability of the price increases. The aftermath of tulip mania also offers lessons about recovering from financial crises. The Dutch government's intervention, while imperfect, prevented the bubble from causing a broader economic collapse. By voiding most of the speculative contracts, authorities limited the contagion effects that might have spread to other sectors of the economy. The Dutch banking and credit systems remained intact, allowing normal economic activity to continue. Within a few years, the tulip crisis had faded from public attention, and the Dutch Republic continued its golden age. However, the psychological scars of tulip mania may have been more lasting. Dutch culture developed a reputation for financial conservatism and suspicion of speculation. The memory of the tulip craze reinforced traditional Dutch values of thrift, hard work, and prudence. While other European nations experienced numerous financial bubbles in subsequent centuries, the Netherlands largely avoided similar episodes. The lesson of 1637 seemed to have been internalized by Dutch society. Modern scholars continue to debate the significance of tulip mania. Some argue that the episode has been exaggerated and that its economic impact was minimal. Others maintain that it represents a genuine historical bubble with important lessons for understanding financial markets. The debate reflects broader disagreements about the nature of markets and the role of speculation in economic development. Are markets fundamentally rational, with prices reflecting underlying values? Or are markets prone to episodes of collective irrationality driven by psychological and social factors? What cannot be disputed is the enduring fascination with tulip mania. The story of a society going mad over flower bulbs captures the imagination precisely because it seems so absurd. How could rational people believe that a tulip bulb was worth a house? Yet the episode reminds us that human beings are not always rational economic actors. We are influenced by emotions, social pressures, and cognitive biases that can lead us astray. The tulip craze also highlights the role of novelty in creating bubbles. The Dutch had no previous experience with tulips or the futures markets that developed around them. They lacked the historical perspective to recognize that they were in a bubble. Each generation seems to believe that this time is different, that the current boom is based on fundamental changes that justify ever-rising prices. Only in retrospect does the delusion become apparent. Financial innovation played a crucial role in tulip mania. The futures market in tulip bulbs was a relatively new financial instrument in the 1630s. It allowed people to speculate with borrowed money and to trade assets they never intended to own. This innovation democratized speculation, making it possible for ordinary people to participate in markets that had previously been restricted to wealthy merchants. But it also amplified the potential for excess and made the eventual crash more severe. The Dutch experience with tulip mania raises questions about the regulation of financial markets. Should governments intervene to prevent speculative bubbles from forming? Or should markets be allowed to self-correct, even if that means periodic crashes? The Dutch authorities took a largely hands-off approach until after the bubble had burst, then intervened to limit the damage. This reactive strategy may have been the best available option, but it couldn't prevent the bubble from forming in the first place. The human cost of tulip mania shouldn't be overlooked. While the aggregate economic impact may have been limited, individuals and families suffered real losses. People who had invested their life savings in tulip futures saw their wealth evaporate. Artisans and small merchants who had hoped to improve their circumstances through speculation found themselves in debt. The social fabric of communities was strained as neighbors who had encouraged each other to invest now blamed each other for their losses. Yet the Dutch Republic survived and prospered after tulip mania. The episode didn't prevent the Netherlands from remaining the economic powerhouse of Europe for several more decades. Dutch merchants continued to dominate global trade, and Amsterdam remained the financial capital of the world until the 18th century. The resilience of the Dutch economy suggests that speculative bubbles, while painful, need not cause permanent damage if the underlying economic fundamentals remain sound. The story of tulip mania continues to resonate because it speaks to timeless aspects of human nature. The desire for wealth, the fear of missing out, the willingness to believe in the possibility of easy riches, and the eventual reckoning when reality asserts itself are all part of the human condition. Every generation faces its own version of tulip mania, whether it's railroad stocks, Florida real estate, internet companies, or cryptocurrency. The specific asset changes, but the underlying dynamics remain remarkably similar. What makes us vulnerable to financial bubbles? Part of the answer lies in our cognitive limitations. Human beings are not good at assessing exponential growth or at recognizing when prices have diverged from fundamental values. We rely on social proof, looking to others' behavior as a guide for our own decisions. When everyone around us is making money, it's natural to want to participate. Our brains are wired for pattern recognition, and we see patterns even in random noise, convincing ourselves that we understand market movements when we don't. The lesson of tulip mania is not that people are foolish or that markets are inherently irrational. Rather, it's that even sophisticated, educated people can be caught up in collective delusions under the right circumstances. The Dutch of the 1630s were not stupid. They were among the most advanced and prosperous people in the world. Yet they convinced themselves that tulip bulbs were worth fortunes. If it could happen to them, it can happen to anyone. The question is not whether future bubbles will occur, but when and in what form. As long as humans engage in financial transactions, there will be episodes of excessive speculation and painful corrections. The challenge is to recognize bubbles while they're forming and to resist the temptation to participate in obvious irrationality. But history suggests this is extraordinarily difficult. The very factors that make a bubble possible also make it hard to recognize from the inside. In the end, Tulip Mania serves as both a historical curiosity and a timeless parable. It reminds us that value is subjective and that prices can diverge wildly from any rational assessment of worth. It shows us that financial innovation, while generally beneficial, can also enable destructive speculation. And it demonstrates that even the most advanced and sophisticated societies are not immune to collective folly. The tulip bulbs that once sold for fortunes are now worth a few euros at most. But the lessons of tulip mania remain priceless.